Hi there. Please let your mind slow down and go at ease, and let me know in the comments where you're from. Also, what's your best tip for a peaceful night's sleep and keeping a calm mind? Whether it's a relaxing bedtime ritual, a favorite book, or a mindfulness practice, your advice could be just what someone needs. The lake's whisper. The lake was quiet, serene, a wide, glassy expanse surrounded by towering pine trees. It had become my retreat, a place to unwind and escape the stress of city life. I would drive up every few weekends, bringing a tent, supplies, and a fishing rod, eager to spend a few peaceful days alone by the water. But on my latest trip, things felt different. The air was colder, the silence heavier, as though something were watching, hidden among the trees. I shrugged off the feeling, telling myself it was just the autumn chill, the loneliness of the woods. I set up camp, made a fire, and sat by the lake as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the water. As night fell, a thick mist rolled in, curling across the surface of the lake like ghostly fingers. I watched, mesmerized, as the fog deepened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet from the shore. The world felt smaller, enclosed, as though I were the only person left alive. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a soft, lilting melody, drifting over the water. It was faint at first, like a lullaby carried on the wind, but as I listened, it grew louder, clearer, filling the night air. The voice was high and sweet, yet somehow sad, a haunting, mournful sound that seemed to echo across the lake. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked down to the shore, peering through the thick mist. The water was still, reflecting the pale light of the moon. But there, in the center of the lake, I saw a figure. A woman, standing knee-deep in the water, her long hair flowing around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on something far away. She was singing, her voice carrying over the water, filling the air with that same haunting melody. I felt a strange pull, an urge to step into the lake, to join her. My feet moved on their own, sinking into the cold, murky water as I waded closer, captivated by her song. But as I approached, her singing stopped. She turned, her gaze locking onto mine, and I froze. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark and empty, filled with a sorrow that seemed endless. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Only a low, hollow whisper that echoed in my mind. Join me. The words sent a shock of fear through me, breaking the trance. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing, and waded back to the shore, my heart pounding. The mist thickened, swallowing her figure, and within moments she was gone, leaving only silence. I packed up and left the lake that night, driving through the darkness with her voice still echoing in my mind, her hollow gaze burned into my memory. I haven't returned since, and even now I can still hear her song, drifting through the silence, calling me back to the lake. The cemetery watcher. There's a cemetery just outside of town, tucked away behind a line of old oak trees. It's a quiet, peaceful place, overgrown with ivy and shaded by tall, looming pines. Most people avoid it though, There's an old legend that says the cemetery is watched over by a restless spirit, a figure who appears at night, guarding the graves. I never believed the stories, so one Halloween night, I decided to see it for myself. Armed with a flashlight and more confidence than sense, I made my way through the trees, the cemetery looming ahead, shadowed and silent. The air was cool, thick with the scent of damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my feet. The graves were old, some so worn that the names were barely visible. I wandered through the rows, my flashlight casting long shadows over the headstones, trying to ignore the sense of unease that crept over me. The silence felt heavy, almost unnatural, as though the air itself held its breath. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw something. A figure standing at the far edge of the cemetery, half hidden by shadows. It was tall, cloaked in black, with its head bowed, hands folded in front of it. The figure was motionless, watching over the graves, its presence eerie and unsettling. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, but curiosity drove me forward. I approached slowly, keeping my flashlight aimed at the figure, but no matter how close I got, it didn't move, didn't react. It was like a statue, frozen in place, its gaze fixed on something far away. Then, just as I reached it, my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with it, trying to turn it back on, but the batteries were dead. I was left alone in the pitch black, with only the faint outline of the figure visible in the moonlight. And then it moved. It lifted its head, turning to face me, its eyes dark and empty, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to press down on me, suffocating. The figure raised a hand, reaching out toward me, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, a chill that seeped into my bones, freezing me in place. I stumbled backward, heart racing, and bolted from the cemetery, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the trees. When I reached the edge of the cemetery, I glanced back, expecting to see it standing there, watching me leave. But the cemetery was empty, silent, as though nothing had been there at all. I still don't know who or what I saw that night, but every time I pass the cemetery, I feel its gaze, watching, waiting, as though it remembers me, as though it's waiting for me to return. The shadow at the foot of the bed. I've always been a light sleeper, easily disturbed by the smallest sounds, so I've developed a habit of keeping my room pitch dark at night. I use thick blackout curtains to block out any trace of moonlight, leaving the room in complete darkness. It had become my sanctuary, a quiet, safe place to rest after long days. But one night, that peace was shattered. It started subtly. I would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling a strange pressure, as though someone were watching me. I'd lie there, my heart pounding, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the feeling grew stronger with each passing night, until I could no longer ignore it. One night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I felt it, a shift in the air, a coldness that seeped into the room. I opened my eyes, my breath catching as I saw it, a figure standing at the foot of my bed, cloaked in darkness. I could barely make out its shape in the dim light filtering through a gap in the curtains, but it was unmistakably there, watching me. I lay frozen, too afraid to move, my heart pounding as I stared at the figure. It was tall, its form shadowy and indistinct, like a smudge against the darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, a heavy, piercing stare that seemed to burrow into me, filling me with a deep, primal fear. I wanted to scream, to bolt from the bed, but I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, pinned down by some invisible force. The figure remained still, its presence oppressive, suffocating. The room grew colder, and I could feel my breath hitching, my pulse racing as the seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. And then, slowly, the figure began to move. It leaned closer, its shadow stretching over me, its face drawing nearer. I squeezed my eyes shut, too terrified to watch, feeling its cold breath on my skin. I could hear it now, a faint whisper, a voice barely audible, speaking words I couldn't understand. The figure lingered for what felt like hours, its presence heavy and unyielding. Finally, I opened my eyes, and it was gone. The room was empty, silent, as though nothing had happened. But the fear remained, gnawing at me, refusing to let go. Since that night, I sleep with a light on, unable to bear the darkness. But sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, I feel it, the weight of that gaze, the coldness of its presence, and I know that it's still there, watching, waiting, just beyond the edge of the light. The doll that moved. My grandmother was an avid collector of porcelain dolls. Her house was filled with them, lining every shelf, their glassy eyes staring out from behind glass cases. As a child, I found them unsettling, their lifelike faces frozen in serene expressions, their eyes seeming to follow me wherever I went. But my grandmother loved them, treating them like cherished family members. When she passed away, my mother inherited her collection, placing many of the dolls in our living room. I hated it, feeling their eyes on me every time I entered, their faces lit by the faint glow of the hallway light. But there was one doll that unsettled me the most. A small, pale figure with dark curls and a lacy blue dress. Its expression was different from the others, its mouth twisted into a faint, eerie smile that sent chills down my spine. One night, I was alone in the house, sitting in the living room reading, when I felt it, a faint, inexplicable sense that I wasn't alone. I glanced up, my eyes drawn to the doll, its gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, brushing off the feeling as paranoia. But when I looked up again, the doll's head had shifted, ever so slightly, its face now angled directly toward me. My heart pounded, and I stared at it, trying to convince myself that it had always been facing that way, that I was imagining things. I stood, moving closer to the doll, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch it. But just as my fingers brushed against its dress, I heard it, a faint, soft giggle, drifting through the silence like a whisper. I froze, my blood running cold, as the sound faded, leaving only silence. I backed away, my eyes locked on the doll, half expecting it to move again. I sat down, keeping it in my sight, but the unease grew, pressing down on me, filling the room with a heavy, oppressive tension. Later that night, I decided to test it. I placed the doll facing the wall, making sure it couldn't see me. I went to bed, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering fear. But when I woke up the next morning, the doll was sitting on the edge of the bed, its cold, glassy eyes staring directly into mine, its smile wider than I remembered. I left the house that morning, and when I returned, the doll was gone. My mother claimed she had donated it, but part of me wonders if it left on its own, seeking out someone else to watch, someone else to haunt. And every now and then I hear that faint, eerie giggle echoing through the silence, a reminder that it's still out there, watching, waiting for the next person to cross its path. The forgotten painting. After my aunt passed away, I inherited her old Victorian house, a grand but neglected mansion filled with antique furniture, dusty chandeliers, and ornate decorations from another era. She had always been a bit eccentric, her home a treasure trove of curiosities. The most intriguing of these was an enormous painting in the upstairs hallway, a dark, moody portrait of a woman in a flowing black dress, her face pale, her expression cold and distant. The painting had always unnerved me. It was as though the woman's gaze followed you wherever you went, her dark eyes sharp and piercing, capturing some hidden sorrow that seemed to bleed from the canvas. My aunt had always refused to speak about it, brushing off my childhood questions with a vague smile. She'd called the woman the lady of the house and acted as though she were a part of the family. The first night I stayed in the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house was cold, empty, filled with a silence that felt almost alive. As I wandered through the hallways, I kept glancing at the portrait, half expecting to see the woman's expression change, her eyes shift. But each time she remained the same, her gaze unblinking, her lips set in a stern, almost resentful line. As I passed the painting on my way to bed, I noticed something strange. There was a faint shimmer around her eyes, like a glint of moisture. I blinked, thinking it must be a trick of the light, but when I looked again, the glint was gone. I brushed it off, telling myself it was my imagination, the eerie atmosphere of the house playing tricks on my mind. But that night, I dreamt of her. I was standing in the hallway, the house bathed in moonlight, everything quiet and still. In the dream, the woman in the portrait turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. Her expression shifted, her lips parting as though she were about to speak. A chill washed over me, and I backed away, but I couldn't tear my gaze from hers. She opened her mouth, whispering something too faint to hear, her voice like a distant echo that sent shivers down my spine. I awoke with a start, my heart racing, her voice lingering in my mind. I tried to shake off the dream, but the memory of her gaze, her dark, sorrowful eyes, haunted me. The next morning, I noticed something chilling. The painting had changed. The woman's expression was softer, her lips slightly parted, her eyes filled with an almost pleading look. It was as though she were silently begging me to listen, to understand. I told myself it was impossible, that I must have been mistaken. But over the next few days, the painting changed subtly, her expression shifting, her eyes growing darker, more intense, filled with a sorrow that seemed almost unbearable. I couldn't escape her gaze. Every time I passed by, I felt her eyes boring into me, her silent plea filling the room with a heavy, oppressive sadness. One night, as I was locking up, I heard it, a faint, muffled sound like someone sobbing. It was coming from the hallway, echoing through the empty house, soft but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I approached the painting, the sobbing growing louder, filled with a pain that made my chest ache. I stood before the portrait, transfixed, the woman's face now twisted in anguish, her eyes wet with tears that seemed ready to spill from the canvas. I whispered, "What do you want?" The words barely more than a breath, but in the silence they sounded deafening. The sobbing stopped, replaced by a chilling quiet that seemed to press down on me, suffocating. The woman's face softened, her expression calm, almost grateful, and then she smiled. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind reeling. The painting was just canvas and paint, yet her presence felt alive, her gaze knowing, aware. I fled to my room, locking the door, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I decided to cover the painting, draping it with an old sheet. But the next morning, the sheet was gone, folded neatly at the foot of the stairs. The woman's gaze seemed colder, more accusing, her silent message clear. She wasn't going to be ignored. I moved out of the house shortly after, unable to bear the weight of her gaze, the sorrow that filled each room. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear her voice, a soft, mournful whisper that drifts through the darkness, calling out to me, reminding me of the lady I left behind in that forgotten house.